There's a specific, quieter category of suffering worth examining directly, distinct from the more dramatic breakdown we've traced extensively throughout previous conversations in this series. Today, we're tracing 5 specific signs that indicate genuine, deep suffering is occurring, even when especially when his external presentation continues suggesting otherwise. Sign 1. Uncharacteristic isolation from people who previously provided reliable admiration. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about how heavily narcissistic stability depends on consistent external validation. When genuine, deep suffering occurs, a specific pattern often emerges worth understanding directly. Withdrawal, even from sources of admiration that would ordinarily be actively pursued and maintained. This might look like declining social invitations he'd normally accept eagerly, reduced engagement with social media despite previous heavy reliance on it for validation, general avoidance of exactly the audiences his psychology typically depends on for stability. This withdrawal is worth understanding as genuinely different from simple busyness or genuine preference for solitude. It reflects something closer to depletion, a temporary inability to perform the confident, engaging persona that securing admiration typically requires, because the underlying psychological resources that persona depends on have become genuinely, if temporarily, exhausted. Sign 2. Uncharacteristic vulnerability that arrives without any apparent strategic purpose. Remember what we traced extensively throughout our conversation about narcissists during no contact, and the manufactured vulnerability designed to provoke specific reactions. Genuine suffering produces something distinguishable from this strategic version. Vulnerability that arrives without clear audience, without obvious attempt to secure any particular outcome. Sometimes even vulnerability expressed to people who have no power to provide the reconciliation or validation strategic vulnerability typically seeks. This might manifest as uncharacteristically honest comments to a therapist, a sibling, or even a stranger, revealing genuine distress without the polish and timing that typically characterizes strategic emotional performance. Sign 3. Physical symptoms consistent with sustained psychological distress. Remember what we traced extensively throughout our conversation about narcissistic breakdown following permanent loss. The sleep disruption, the behavioral incongruence that reflects genuine, rather than performed crisis. Deep suffering often manifests physically. Noticeable weight changes, visible fatigue, decreased attention to physical appearance despite previous investment in exactly this kind of self-presentation. These physical markers matter because they're genuinely difficult to fake or perform convincingly over sustained periods, which makes them more reliable indicators of authentic distress than anything he might say or post publicly. Sign 4. Increased uncharacteristic reliance on substances or compulsive behaviors. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about how narcissistic psychology depends on external regulation it cannot reliably generate internally. When genuine suffering occurs and usual sources of regulation become unavailable, this dependency sometimes redirects toward substances, compulsive spending, compulsive work, or other behaviors that provide temporary, artificial regulation in the absence of the interpersonal sources his psychology typically relies on. Sign 5. A specific, uncharacteristic humility that surfaces briefly before typically retreating. This connects directly to something we traced extensively throughout our conversation about what narcissists do when they know they're guilty. The brief window before defensive processing fully neutralizes genuine acknowledgement. Deep suffering sometimes produces momentary flashes of genuine humility, genuine questioning of his own behavior and his own patterns, occurring specifically during periods of significant distress when his usual defensive architecture has been genuinely overwhelmed rather than simply challenged. Let's examine these 5 signs more closely, because understanding what distinguishes genuine suffering from performed distress matters considerably more than simply recognizing surface behavior, particularly since several of these signs can be misread in ways that produce either false hope or false dismissal. Here's what's crucial to understand about sign 1, uncharacteristic isolation, because distinguishing it from simple busyness or genuine preference for solitude requires understanding something specific about timing and context. Remember what we traced extensively throughout our conversation about narcissistic identity depending on consistent audience for stability. Genuine, suffering-driven isolation typically occurs in contexts where his psychology would ordinarily seek engagement rather than avoid it, declining opportunities for admiration he'd normally actively pursue, going quiet on platforms where he'd typically maintain active presence. This differs meaningfully from someone who's simply genuinely busy or genuinely enjoying solitude for unrelated reasons, which means context matters enormously. Isolation from specifically the sources of validation he's historically depended on most heavily carries more diagnostic weight than general reduction in social activity. Here's what's worth understanding about sign 2, uncharacteristic vulnerability without strategic purpose, because distinguishing genuine from strategic vulnerability requires exactly the discernment we traced extensively throughout our conversation about manufactured versus authentic emotional expression. The key distinguishing factor remains audience and outcome. Genuine vulnerability arising from actual suffering often gets expressed to people who have no power to provide reconciliation or restored access to whatever he's lost, sometimes even to people whose response he cannot control or predict. Strategic vulnerability, by contrast, almost always targets someone specifically positioned to provide the outcome he's seeking, timed and delivered with a polish that genuine overwhelmed distress typically lacks. Here's what's worth understanding about sign 3, physical symptoms of distress, connecting to something important about why this sign proves particularly reliable compared to verbal or behavioral signs that can potentially be performed. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about narcissists remaining skilled at managing narrative and managing perception through verbal and social channels. Physical symptoms: genuine weight change, genuine visible fatigue, genuine decline in the self-presentation he'd normally maintain carefully, prove considerably harder to fake convincingly over sustained periods, which means their presence carries more diagnostic weight than almost anything he might say directly, precisely because his psychology has less practice capacity to consciously manage or perform these specific physical markers. Here's what's worth understanding about sign 4, increased reliance on substances or compulsive behaviors, connecting to something we traced extensively about how genuine crisis produces desperate attempts at self-regulation when interpersonal sources become unavailable. This sign matters because it often becomes visible even when he's successfully maintaining the appearance of stability in every other observable domain. Professional performance might remain intact. Social presentation might remain largely unchanged, while this specific dimension reveals genuine internal struggle occurring beneath an otherwise successfully maintained surface. Here's what's worth understanding about sign 5, the brief window of genuine humility, connecting directly to everything we traced extensively throughout our conversation about what narcissists do when they know they're guilty. This sign proves the most fleeting and the most difficult to observe reliably, precisely because it exists specifically within the narrow window before defensive processing neutralizes it. If you happen to witness this specific sign, understand it as genuinely real, while it's occurring, while also remembering everything we established about how rarely this brief window translates into anything sustained or comprehensive. Here's something crucial worth understanding about why recognizing all five of these signs together, rather than any single one in isolation, matters considerably more for accurate assessment. Any single sign alone might indicate something unrelated to genuine suffering entirely. Isolation might simply reflect a busy period. Physical changes might reflect unrelated health circumstances. Vulnerability might still be strategic, even if it initially appears otherwise. The genuine diagnostic value emerges specifically from these signs clustering together, occurring simultaneously across multiple domains in ways that collectively suggest something more comprehensive than any single explanation could account for. Because here's what all of this ultimately needs to lead toward, and it's worth being direct about it rather than leaving this conversation as simply a diagnostic checklist without addressing what genuinely matters most. What you're actually supposed to do with this information, and why recognizing genuine suffering, if you do encounter it, doesn't change anything about what your own healing requires. The first thing worth understanding clearly is something we've traced throughout dozens of previous conversations, but that deserves specific emphasis here. Recognizing these five signs, even if you observe all of them clustering together in ways that suggest genuine, comprehensive suffering, doesn't obligate you to anything at all. Remember what we established extensively throughout our conversation about the narcissist you left being on the verge of collapse. The crucial distinction between holding genuine, complicated human feeling about someone's suffering and believing that feeling requires intervention, reconciliation, or reconsideration of boundaries you established for genuinely sound reasons. Here's the second thing worth understanding, one that addresses something important about why genuine suffering, even confirmed suffering exactly as we've traced it throughout today's conversation, doesn't actually indicate genuine change or genuine safety for renewed relationship. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about the structural nature of narcissistic psychology's incapacity for sustained accountability. Suffering, even genuine and comprehensive suffering, doesn't automatically produce insight, doesn't automatically produce behavioral change, doesn't automatically resolve into anything resembling the sustained, demonstrated transformation that would actually make renewed closeness safe or wise. Someone can genuinely, deeply suffer and still return once that suffering eventually resolves through whatever combination of time and supply diversification circumstances allow, to exactly the same patterns that produced the original harm. Here's the third thing worth understanding, one that circles back to something we've emphasized throughout this entire series in countless different forms. Whether he's genuinely suffering or not was never actually the metric your own healing needed to depend on. This is worth stating directly because it's easy, having traced these five signs in such careful detail, to start treating his confirmed suffering as some form of validation or justice, satisfying in ways that risk keeping you oriented around tracking and confirming his internal experience, rather than fully redirecting your attention toward your own continued life. Here's the fourth thing worth understanding, one that addresses something genuinely important about holding compassion appropriately if you do encounter evidence of genuine suffering. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about human complexity, about the capacity to hold multiple, sometimes contradictory feelings simultaneously without requiring false resolution. You're allowed to feel genuine sadness that another human being is suffering, even someone who caused you significant harm, while simultaneously maintaining complete clarity that this sadness doesn't obligate you to anything, doesn't require you to reconsider protective boundaries, doesn't diminish the validity of everything you experienced and everything that led you to establish those boundaries in the first place. Here's the fifth and final thing worth understanding, the piece that ultimately matters most as we close this entire conversation. If you find yourself encountering evidence of genuine suffering, whether through direct observation or through information reaching you indirectly, understand that this evidence, however genuine, was never actually the thing your own peace was waiting for. Your peace was always meant to develop through the internal work this entire series has traced across dozens of conversations. The grief, the rebuilt self-trust, the alternative sources of meaning, regardless of whether his suffering ever became visible to you, and regardless of what you do or don't ever learn about the genuine state of his internal experience. His suffering, if it's genuinely occurring exactly as we've traced throughout today's conversation, belongs entirely to his own separate journey, one requiring his own genuine work, his own genuine willingness to tolerate exactly the discomfort his defensive architecture was built to avoid in order to produce anything resembling lasting resolution. You are not required to witness this journey, not required to track its progress, not required to feel responsible for its outcome in either direction. Whatever suffering exists independently of your continued attention, and your own life, your own healing, your own genuine wholeness remains exactly as complete and exactly as valid, whether or not you ever receive confirmation that any of the 5 signs we've traced throughout this conversation genuinely, comprehensively apply to him at all.